What happened when the cop who arrested me for matching a description learned I'm the deputy chief's son? The officer's knee pressed into my spine while my face ground against the asphalt parking lot, tasting blood and motor oil and humiliation in equal measure. Officer Drummond had his full weight on me, 200 pounds compressing my lungs until breathing became a conscious effort requiring focus. I couldn't spare while my mind raced through what I'd done to deserve this. I'd been walking to my car after my shift at the bookstore, keys in hand, hoodie up against the October rain, when the cruiser's lights exploded behind me and Drummond's voice cut through the night, ordering me to the ground. No explanation, no question, just the immediate assumption that a black man in this neighborhood after dark must be the suspect they were looking for. My phone had clattered across the pavement when I dropped to my knees as instructed, and I watched it slide under a parked truck while Drummond wrenched my arms behind my back with enough force that my shoulder socket screamed in protest. The metal cuffs bit into my wrists, tightened beyond necessity until I felt my fingers starting to go numb from restricted circulation. I tried to tell Drummond I worked here, that my employee badge was in my pocket, that my car was parked 15 feet away with the bookstore parking permit clearly visible on the dashboard. He told me to shut my mouth before he shut it for me, his voice carrying that specific edge of aggression that meant he was looking for an excuse to escalate this further. Another officer arrived, younger guy whose nameplate read Kowalsski, and he circled around to look at my face pressed against the ground while Drummond kept me pinned. Kowalski asked what we had, and Drummond said he matched the description of a robbery suspect from 3 blocks over. Black male in dark clothing, approximately my height and build. The description was so generic it could have applied to thousands of men in this city, but Drummond had decided I was his guy and nothing I said would change his mind now that he'd committed to this arrest. They hauled me to my feet with hands gripping my arms hard enough to leave bruises, and I stumbled because my legs had gone partially numb from being pressed against cold concrete. Drummond shoved me toward the cruiser while reading me my rights, in a monotone that suggested he'd done this so many times the words had lost all meaning. I was being arrested for armed robbery, he said, and anything I said could be used against me in court. I tried again to explain that I worked at the bookstore, that I had witnesses who could verify I'd been inside until 5 minutes ago, that this was a mistake that could be easily resolved if they'd just check my identification. Drummond responded by slamming me against the side of his cruiser face first, my cheekbone connecting with the metal door frame with enough impact that I saw stars. He told me. He'd warned me to shut up, that resisting arrest would only make this worse for me, though I hadn't resisted anything except the urge to panic completely as this situation spiraled beyond my control. The back seat of the cruiser smelled like vomit and industrial cleaner, a combination that made my stomach turn while I sat with my hands cuffed behind me in a position that made every pothole feel like my shoulders were dislocating. Drummond and Kowalski talked in the front seat about their shift, about overtime pay, about weekend plans, their voices casual and relaxed, as if they hadn't just brutalized an innocent man and destroyed his evening over a lazy assumption based on nothing more than my skin color and the fact that I existed in their patrol area. I focused on breathing through my nose and trying not to vomit from the smell and the pain and the adrenaline crash that was making my hands shake. The drive to the station took 12 minutes according to the dashboard clock I could see through the partition. 12 minutes of sitting in handcuffs too tight while my face throbbed and my mind raced through the consequences of this arrest, even if they eventually figured out their mistake. The booking process was designed to strip away dignity systematically, reducing a person to measurements and photographs and fingerprints that would live in databases forever, regardless of whether charges were ultimately filed. They logged my personal effects in a plastic bag after finally removing the cuffs, and my wrists showed deep red marks where the metal had cut into skin. The booking officer, an older woman with gray hair and tired eyes, asked routine questions about my name and address and emergency contacts while I answered automatically, my voice flat and distant like I was watching this happen to someone else. When she asked for my father's name and contact information as next of kin, I hesitated before answering, and she repeated the question with more impatience. I gave her his name, Marcus Wright, and his cell number, and she wrote it down without any reaction, because she had no reason to recognize the name of the man who ran this entire department as deputy chief of the city police force. They put me in a holding cell that smelled like sweat and desperation. Concrete walls covered in scratched graffiti and phone numbers, and crude drawings that represented years of people waiting in this same space. 3 other men occupied the cell when I arrived, and they barely looked up from their positions on the metal benches that lined 2 walls. I found a spot in the corner and sat with my back against the cold concrete, my face still throbbing from where Drummond had slammed it against the cruiser. My phone was gone, still under that truck in the parking lot where it had slid when Drummond ordered me down, which meant I couldn't call anyone to explain what happened or start the process of getting legal help. The only call I'd get would be from a phone in this building under supervision, and I wasn't ready to make that call yet, because I was still processing the reality of being arrested for a crime I didn't commit, based solely on the fact that I was black and in the wrong place at what Drummond had decided was the wrong time. 2 hours passed before anyone came for me, 2 hours of sitting in that cell while my mind replayed every moment of the arrest, looking for what I should have done differently. I could have kept my hoodie down despite the rain, made myself more visible, more identifiable as someone who belonged in that parking lot. I could have walked a different direction, taken the long way to my car, avoided crossing paths with Drummond's cruiser entirely. But every alternative scenario still came back to the same truth. I shouldn't have had to adjust my behavior or my route or my clothing to avoid being brutalized by police doing their job incompetently. The cell door finally opened, and a uniformed officer I didn't recognize told me I had a phone call, gesturing for me to follow him down a corridor lined with more holding cells, each one containing people waiting for processing or transfers or lawyers who might never come. The phone was mounted on the wall in a small room that reeked of cigarette smoke, despite the no-smoking signs posted everywhere. The officer left me alone but stood visible through the small window in the door, watching to make sure I didn't try anything stupid with the 20 minutes they'd allocated for this call. I picked up the receiver and dialed my father's cell number, the same number I'd given the booking officer, and he answered on the third ring with his professional voice that meant he was probably in a meeting or at dinner with someone important. I told him it was me, and his tone changed immediately, going from formal to concerned in the space of a single syllable. I explained what happened as calmly as I could manage, walking through the arrest and Drummond's accusations and the holding cell and the fact that I'd been sitting here for 2 hours while they processed me for a robbery I had nothing to do with. Dad's silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought the call might have dropped, but then he asked me very carefully to repeat the officer's name and badge number. I gave him Drummond's information, and Dad's breathing changed, in a way I recognized from the few times I'd seen him genuinely angry rather than just frustrated or disappointed. He told me not to say anything else to anyone, not to answer any questions, not to sign anything, and that he was coming to the station immediately with our family lawyer. His voice carried that specific quality of controlled rage that meant someone was about to have a very bad day, but he didn't elaborate on what he planned to do or who he planned to talk to. He just said he'd be there in 20 minutes and I should sit tight and remember that I had the right to remain silent until our lawyer arrived. The AOE call ended, and I stood holding the dead receiver for a moment before hanging it up and letting the officer escort me back to the holding cell where the other 3 men were now sleeping or pretending to sleep on the uncomfortable metal benches. 30 minutes passed before the cell door opened again, and a sergeant I didn't recognize told me to come with him, his expression neutral, but his body language suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else right now. He led me through a different corridor than before, this one cleaner and better lit, past offices where detectives worked at desks covered in files and coffee cups. We ended up in an interview room with a metal table bolted to the floor and 4 chairs arranged around it, and the sergeant told me to sit and wait while someone came to talk to me. He left, without closing the door completely, and through the gap, I could hear raised voices from somewhere deeper in the station, my father's distinctive tone cutting through whatever explanations or excuses were being offered. The voices got louder and closer until Dad appeared in the doorway, followed by a woman in an expensive suit who I recognized as Diane Foster, the attorney who'd handled my parents' estate planning and my college application issues when a scholarship committee had discriminated against me. Dad looked at my face, and his jaw tightened when he saw the bruising already forming across my cheekbone and around my eye. He didn't say anything, just turned to Diane and told her to document everything visible. She pulled out her phone and took multiple photos of my face from different angles, then photographed my wrists where the cuffs had left deep marks in my skin. Behind them in the hallway, I could see Captain Reeves, my father's direct subordinate, looking distinctly uncomfortable while 2 other officers I didn't recognize stood at a respectful distance. Dad finally spoke to me directly, asking if I was hurt anywhere else or if I needed medical attention before we proceeded. I told him my shoulder was badly strained from how Drummond had wrenched my arms back and my ribs hurt from where his knee had been pressed into my spine. Diane made notes on her phone while Dad's expression got progressively darker, and I realized this was about to become much bigger than a simple case of mistaken identity and wrongful arrest. Captain Reeves entered the interview room cautiously, clearly aware that he was walking into a situation that could destroy careers and generate lawsuits that would cost the department millions. He started to explain that there had been a robbery 3 blocks from where I was arrested, that Officer Drummond had responded to the call and spotted me matching the description given by witnesses, that the arrest had followed standard procedure for a felony suspect. Dad cut him off before he finished the 3rd sentence, his voice dangerously quiet as he asked Reeves to explain exactly what description Drummond had been working from. Reeves pulled out a notepad and read from it. Black male, approximately 5'10" to 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing including a hoodie, no other distinguishing features mentioned. Dad let the silence stretch after Reeves finished reading, and I watched the captain's face as he realized how completely inadequate that description was for justifying the violent arrest of someone who'd been doing nothing more suspicious than walking to their car after work. Diane took over the questioning, her attorney voice crisp and professional as she asked Reeves to explain why no attempt had been made to verify my identity before making the arrest. why excessive force had been used on someone who wasn't resisting, why I'd been held for over 2 hours without formal charges being filed, and why no one had bothered to check my story about working at the bookstore, which would have been easily verified with a single phone call. Reeves had no good answers, just stammered responses about procedure and officer discretion and the need to secure suspects quickly in felony cases. Dad asked if there was body camera footage from the arrest, and Reeves said yes. All officers wore cameras during their shifts, and the footage would be available for review. Dad told him to get the footage immediately, that we'd all watch it together right now, and that Captain Reeves should probably also find Officer Drummond and have him present for this viewing since his career was likely ending tonight. The body camera footage played on a laptop that someone brought into the interview room, and watching myself get brutalized from Drummond's perspective was somehow worse than experiencing it had been. The footage showed me walking across the parking lot, hood up against the rain, keys visibly in my hand, heading toward a car that was clearly mine based on the proximity. Drummond's voice on the audio barked orders at me to get on the ground immediately, and the video showed me complying without resistance or hesitation, dropping to my knees with my hands visible as instructed. Then, it showed Drummond approaching with his weapon drawn, shoving me flat with his boot, before kneeling on my spine with his full weight. The audio captured me trying to explain that I worked at the bookstore, that this was a mistake, and it captured Drummond telling me to shut up with that aggressive edge in his voice that had made my stomach clench during the actual encounter. The video showed him slamming my face against his cruiser, showed the excessive tightening of the handcuffs, showed every moment of unnecessary violence inflicted on someone who was cooperating completely. Officer Drummond arrived in the interview room looking confused about why he'd been summoned, and his confusion shifted to concern when he saw me sitting at the table with my father and our lawyer. His eyes widened slightly when someone introduced my father by his full title and rank, and I watched the realization hit him that he'd just arrested the deputy chief's son for matching a description so vague it could apply to half the black men in the city. Dad asked Drummond very calmly to explain his reasoning for the arrest, to walk everyone through his decision-making process from the moment he received the robbery call to the moment he had me pinned face down in the parking lot. Drummond's explanation was textbook example of racial profiling disguised as police work, talking about high crime areas and suspicious behavior and the need to trust his instincts when someone matched even a partial description. Dad let him talk himself deeper into the hole, never interrupting, just letting Drummond demonstrate exactly how his biases had led him to brutalize an innocent man. When Drummond finished his explanation, Dad asked him if he'd made any attempt to verify my identity before making the arrest, if he'd asked where I was coming from or where I was going, if he'd noticed the employee badge visible in my pocket, or the car I was clearly walking toward. Drummond admitted he hadn't done any of those things, because suspects often lied, and he'd learned to secure people first, and ask questions later when dealing with felony cases. Dad's voice stayed perfectly calm as he pointed out that I wasn't a suspect, but a citizen walking to my car after work, that the description Drummond had been working from was so generic as to be useless, and that every action Drummond had taken demonstrated a pattern of assuming criminality based solely on my race. He asked Drummond to explain why he'd slammed my face against his cruiser when I was already restrained and compliant, why he'd tightened the handcuffs beyond what was necessary, why he'd used excessive force on someone who posed no threat and had committed no crime. Drummond had no good answers, just defensive stammering about feeling threatened and needing to maintain control of the situation. Diane played the body camera footage again with commentary this time, pointing out each instance where Drummond's actions exceeded what was necessary or justified. She highlighted the moment when I complied immediately with his orders, the moment when I tried to provide identifying information, the moment when he used violence to silence me rather than taking 2 minutes to verify my story. She asked Drummond to point out any moment in the footage where I appeared threatening or resistant or deserving of the treatment he'd given me. He couldn't, because no such moment existed in the video or in reality. The entire arrest had been predicated on lazy policing and racial bias, and now Drummond was sitting in a room with his deputy chief watching evidence of his misconduct play out in high-definition video that would be nearly impossible to defend in any court or disciplinary hearing. Captain Reeves looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor while this played out, clearly calculating how much of the blame would land on him as the supervising officer who'd failed to catch this during the initial processing. Dad turned his attention to Reeves and asked how many other arrests Drummond had made following similar patterns, how many other black men had been brutalized based on vague descriptions and officer instinct rather than actual evidence. Reeves admitted he didn't know off the top of his head, but could pull Drummond's arrest records for review. Dad told him to do exactly that, tonight, and to have a full report on his desk by morning detailing every arrest Drummond had made in the past 3 years, along with demographic breakdowns and outcome data. The implication was clear. This wasn't an isolated incident, but likely part of a pattern that had been allowed to continue because no one with authority had bothered to look closely at what Drummond was doing on his shifts. The interview room door opened and the police chief himself walked in. Thomas Garrett, the man my father reported to, and who I'd met exactly twice at department functions my parents had dragged me to. Chief Garrett looked at the assembled group, and his expression suggested someone had already briefed him on what was happening and why his Friday evening had been interrupted. He asked my father for a private word, and they stepped into the hallway together, leaving me with Diane, while Drummond and Reeves sat in uncomfortable silence at the opposite end of the table. Through the glass window in the door, I could see Dad and Chief Garrett having an intense conversation, their body language suggesting disagreement about how to handle this situation. Dad's position was clear from his gestures: immediate action, public accountability, consequences for Drummond that would send a message throughout the department. Chief Garrett's responses suggested he was worried about public relations and legal liability, and the complications that came with disciplining an officer for doing his job even if he'd done it badly. The conversation lasted 15 minutes before both men returned to the interview room, and Chief Garrett's face told me that my father had won whatever argument they'd been having. Garrett addressed Drummond directly, informing him that he was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into tonight's arrest and a review of his prior conduct. Drummond started to object, but Garrett cut him off, explaining that the body camera footage alone showed multiple violations of department policy regarding use of force and treatment of suspects. His badge and weapon would be surrendered immediately, and he was not to have any contact with me or my family while the investigation proceeded. Internal Affairs would be conducting interviews starting tomorrow morning, and Drummond should consider retaining legal counsel because the department would not be defending his actions if this resulted in a civil rights lawsuit. Drummond's face went from red to pale as the reality of his situation became clear, and he tried one last time to argue that he'd been doing his job the way he'd been trained. Dad's response to that claim was devastating in its simplicity. He pulled up Drummond's training records on the laptop and showed everyone the sections covering suspect rights, use of force continuum, and implicit bias awareness that every officer was required to complete annually. He asked Drummond to point out which part of his training had instructed him to slam compliant suspects into vehicles or to ignore their attempts to provide identifying information or to assume guilt based on skin color and generic descriptions. Drummond had no response because his training had said nothing of the sort. Everything he'd done tonight contradicted his training and department policy, and he'd done it anyway because he'd operated on bias and assumption rather than actual police work. Dad collected Drummond's badge and weapon personally, placing them in an evidence bag while Drummond stood there looking like his world was collapsing around him. Kowalsski, the younger officer who'd assisted with my arrest, was called in next and went through similar questioning about his role in the incident and why he hadn't intervened when his partner's actions clearly exceeded what was necessary. Chief Garrett dismissed everyone except my father, Diane, and me, and once the room cleared, he sat down heavily in one of the chairs looking older than he had when he'd first arrived. He apologized directly to me for what had happened, acknowledging that I'd been subjected to treatment no citizen should experience, and that the department had failed in its fundamental duty to protect and serve all members of the community equally. His apology felt sincere, but also calculated, the words of someone trying to get ahead of inevitable lawsuits and bad press rather than genuine remorse for the system that had allowed this to happen. Diane asked about my criminal record, and Garrett confirmed that tonight's arrest would be expunged completely, that no charges would be filed, and that the incident would be removed from all databases within 72 hours. He offered to have the department's physician examine me and document any injuries, and to provide access to counseling services if I felt I needed them after the trauma of wrongful arrest and assault. Dad asked what would happen to Drummond long-term, beyond the immediate administrative leave, and Garrett's answer was carefully worded to avoid specific promises. The investigation would take 4 to 6 weeks, he said, and the outcome would depend on what patterns emerged from reviewing Drummond's prior arrests and whether other complaints had been filed against him. If the evidence supported termination, the department would pursue it through proper channels, but the police union would fight any discipline aggressively, and the process could drag on for months. Dad's expression made clear that he found this answer inadequate, that he expected swift and definitive action rather than bureaucratic delays that might ultimately result in Drummond returning to duty with a slap on the wrist. Garrett promised that this case would receive priority attention and that he personally would oversee the investigation to ensure it was thorough and objective. But everyone in the room understood that police departments rarely punished their own officers seriously, no matter how egregious the misconduct. Diane packed up her materials and told me she'd be filing a federal civil rights lawsuit against Drummond personally and the department institutionally within the week, seeking damages for false arrest, excessive force, and emotional distress. She explained that the body camera footage gave us an incredibly strong case, that most departments would want to settle quickly rather than risk a jury trial. The settlement money mattered less than the public accountability, she said, but substantial financial consequences were often the only thing that forced systemic changes in how police departments operated. She gave me her card and told me to call her immediately if anyone from the department tried to contact me about the case or pressure me to accept their internal resolution instead of pursuing legal action. Dad thanked her and said he'd be in touch about coordinating our legal strategy with whatever departmental procedures Chief Garrett implemented. We left the station through a side entrance that avoided the main lobby and any reporters who might have caught wind that something significant was happening involving the deputy chief's family. Dad's car was parked in a reserved spot near the door, and I collapsed into the passenger seat feeling exhausted from adrenaline crash and emotional overload. The drive home was quiet for the first few minutes while Dad navigated through late evening traffic, and then he asked how I was really doing beyond the physical injuries that were obvious. I told him honestly that I felt violated and angry and scared in ways I was still processing, that watching myself get brutalized on that body camera footage had made the experience feel fresh all over again. He listened without interrupting, and then shared something I hadn't known. When he was 23 and newly promoted to detective, he'd been stopped by officers from a different precinct who didn't know him and had gone through a similar experience of being treated as a suspect rather than a colleague based entirely on his appearance. The story was worse than mine in some ways, involving guns drawn and explicit racial slurs, and a sergeant who'd refused to believe his identification was legitimate until multiple phone calls confirmed he was actually a police detective. Dad said the experience had shaped his entire career and his approach to leadership within the department, pushing for body cameras and use of force reforms and implicit bias training that many officers resented as political correctness. He'd thought progress was being made, he said, that younger officers were better trained and more aware of their biases than his generation had been. Tonight proved he'd been too optimistic, that officers like Drummond still operated with impunity because the systems designed to check their behavior weren't working as intended. The disappointment in his voice hurt more than the physical pain from my injuries, hearing him grapple with the realization that his decades of work hadn't prevented his own son from experiencing the same brutality he'd endured. We pulled into our driveway, and Mom came out before we'd even turned off the engine, her face showing she already knew something terrible had happened. Dad must have called her from the station before he arrived, giving her the basic outline so she wouldn't be blindsided when we got home. She pulled me into a tight hug that made my ribs ache, but I didn't pull away because I needed the comfort more than I needed to avoid the pain. Inside the house, she made me sit at the kitchen table while she examined my face under the bright lights, her nurse training kicking in as she evaluated whether I needed immediate medical attention beyond what could wait until morning. She decided the facial bruising would heal on its own, but insisted on wrapping my wrists where the handcuffs had cut into skin, her movements gentle and precise, while Dad stood in the doorway watching with that same expression of controlled rage he'd worn at the station. Mom asked what happened next in terms of both my physical recovery and the legal process, and Dad laid out the timeline Diane had discussed. The lawsuit would be filed within days, the investigation would take weeks, and we'd likely face months of depositions and negotiations before reaching any kind of resolution. In the meantime, I should follow up with our family doctor to document all injuries thoroughly, see a therapist to process the trauma, and avoid any contact with Drummond or anyone from his legal team if they tried to reach out. Mom nodded along while Dad talked, but her attention stayed focused on my face, studying the bruises like she could heal them through willpower alone. She asked if I wanted to eat something, and I realized I hadn't eaten since my lunch break at the bookstore over 9 hours ago, but my stomach felt too knotted up to handle food right now. She made me drink water and take ibuprofen for the pain, then sent me upstairs to shower and change into clean clothes that didn't smell like booking cell and fear. The shower helped physically, but watching the water swirl down the drain brought back sense memories of lying face down on that parking lot pavement, Drummond's knee crushing my spine while rain soaked through my hoodie. I stood under the spray for longer than necessary, letting the hot water ease the tension in my shoulders and ribs until the bathroom filled with steam, and Mom knocked on the door asking if I was all right. I assured her I was fine and turned off the water, drying carefully around the bruises that were already turning spectacular shades of purple and yellow across my cheekbone. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone else, someone who'd been in a fight or an accident, not someone who'd been walking peacefully to their car after a normal shift at work. The disconnect between what I knew had happened and what the evidence of my face suggested was disorienting. Sleep was impossible despite exhaustion, my mind replaying the arrest on endless loop while my body stayed hyper-alert for threats that weren't coming. Every small sound in the house made me tense. Every shadow through my bedroom window looked like someone approaching, and I finally gave up around 3 a.m. and went downstairs to find Dad sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and coffee going cold beside him. He was reviewing arrest records, he explained when he saw me, going through Drummond's files personally rather than waiting for Captain Reeves to compile them. What he'd found so far wasn't good. 43 arrests in 3 years, 37 of them involving Black or Latino suspects, and a pattern of excessive force complaints that had been dismissed or settled quietly without significant consequences. Dad's job as deputy chief meant he had access to these records, but also put him in a complicated position regarding what he could do with the information given that he was personally involved in tonight's incident. We talked for over an hour about systemic racism in policing, about how good officers got frustrated watching bad officers face no consequences, about how communities of color learned not to trust police because encounters like mine happened constantly without accountability. Dad shared stories from his career that made me understand why he'd pushed so hard for reforms that other officers viewed as anti-police rather than pro-accountability. He'd arrested dirty cops, testified against colleagues who crossed lines, and made enemies within the department by refusing to participate in the culture of silence that protected misconduct. His position as deputy chief gave him power to implement changes, but also made him a target for officers who resented outside scrutiny of their actions. Tonight's incident with Drummond would become ammunition for both sides. Reformers would use it as evidence that problems persisted despite training and policy changes, while defenders of the status quo would claim it was an isolated incident being blown out of proportion because of my father's position. Monday morning arrived too quickly after a weekend spent documenting injuries, meeting with Diane to finalize the lawsuit paperwork, and trying to pretend life could return to normal when nothing felt normal anymore. I called in sick to the bookstore, unable to face explaining to my manager why my face looked like I'd been beaten, and spent the day at home monitoring social media where the story had leaked despite the department's attempts to keep it quiet. Someone had talked to the press, sharing enough details that reporters were calling it a wrongful arrest case involving a high-ranking official's family member. The coverage split along predictable lines. Some outlets focused on police misconduct and racial profiling. Others emphasized that the investigation was ongoing and officers deserved presumption of innocence. Comment sections on news articles became battlegrounds where people argued about whether my arrest was evidence of systemic racism or just an honest mistake by an officer doing his job under difficult circumstances. The internal affairs investigation kicked off formally on Monday with investigators interviewing everyone involved in my arrest and processing. Dad recused himself from direct involvement, but Chief Garrett kept him updated on progress, acknowledging that my father's position made complete transparency necessary to avoid accusations of cover-up or nepotism in handling the case. The investigators pulled body camera footage from 12 of Drummond's recent arrests and found a disturbing pattern. He was significantly more likely to use force against black suspects than white suspects, more likely to make arrests based on vague descriptions when the suspect was a person of color, and more likely to ignore exculpatory information that contradicted his initial assumptions about guilt. 3 previous complaints against Drummond had been filed by black men who'd been stopped or arrested under circumstances similar to mine, but all 3 complaints had been dismissed after cursory investigation that accepted Drummond's version of events without serious scrutiny of the evidence. Diane filed our lawsuit in federal court on Wednesday with a press conference announcing the action and highlighting not just my individual case, but the pattern of behavior Drummond's record revealed. She stood at a podium in front of the courthouse with me beside her, my bruised face serving as visual evidence of the misconduct we were alleging. Reporters shouted questions about whether my father's position had influenced the decision to file suit, whether we were seeking specific financial damages, and whether we believed the entire department was corrupt, or just this one officer. Diane answered professionally, emphasizing that this lawsuit was about accountability for constitutional violations and preventing future victims of racial profiling and excessive force. The fact that I happened to be the deputy chief's son made this case higher profile than most, she acknowledged, but the fundamental issues were the same ones that affected countless people of color who encountered police under similar circumstances. The police union responded within hours with their own statement defending Drummond as a dedicated officer who'd made a split-second decision in a high-pressure situation, suggesting that Monday morning quarterbacking his actions was unfair and that the lawsuit was politically motivated. The union president appeared on local news claiming my father was using his position to retaliate against an officer who'd done nothing wrong, that the arrest had been justified based on information available at the time, and that the department was throwing Drummond under the bus to avoid bad publicity. The narrative war was fully engaged, with competing versions of reality being promoted through carefully crafted messaging on both sides. Dad watched the union president's interview with disgust, pointing out multiple factual errors and misleading characterizations that painted Drummond as a victim rather than someone who'd brutalized an innocent person. The next 2 weeks brought waves of attention that made leaving the house uncomfortable, with reporters occasionally showing up hoping to get comments or photos, despite Diane's instructions that I wasn't giving interviews beyond the initial press conference. My bruises faded from purple to yellow to eventually disappearing, but the psychological impact was harder to measure and slower to heal. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma from police violence, and our sessions focused on processing the fear and anger and sense of violation that came from being physically dominated by someone with authority and a badge. The therapist helped me understand that my reactions were normal, that hypervigilance and trouble sleeping and difficulty trusting authority figures were all common responses to experiencing police brutality, and that recovery would be gradual rather than instant. Internal Affairs completed their investigation 43 days after my arrest and recommended Drummond's termination for multiple policy violations, including excessive use of force, failure to verify suspect identity before making an arrest, and a pattern of bias in his policing that violated department standards. The recommendation went to Chief Garrett for final decision, and Dad told me that internal politics would determine whether Garrett actually pulled the trigger on firing an officer with union backing. The union threatened to strike if Drummond was terminated, arguing that he'd become a scapegoat for larger political battles about police reform. Garrett scheduled a hearing where Drummond could present his defense, and the outcome would determine not just one officer's career, but potentially the direction of reform efforts across the entire department. The hearing happened in a conference room at police headquarters with Drummond, his union representative, Chief Garrett, and a panel of senior officers reviewing the internal affairs findings. Dad and I weren't allowed to attend because we were witnesses and complainants rather than participants in the disciplinary process, but Garrett briefed us afterward on what had occurred. Drummond had maintained throughout that his actions were justified, that he'd followed his training in securing a felony suspect, and that the injury to my face had been accidental rather than intentional excessive force. His union representative argued that termination was too harsh a penalty for what amounted to a judgment call made in good faith under stressful conditions. The panel deliberated for 6 hours before reaching their decision. Drummond would be terminated for violating department policies, effective immediately, with no opportunity for reinstatement. The decision sparked immediate controversy with the union, calling it a politically motivated witch hunt, and promising appeals through every available channel. Drummond gave interviews claiming his career had been destroyed because he'd arrested the wrong person, that any officer could make the same mistake, and now lived in fear of losing everything if they made decisions that offended powerful families. The narrative completely ignored the excessive force, the racial profiling, the pattern of similar behavior in his past arrests, focusing instead on painting him as a martyr to political correctness. Some officers talked about retiring early or transferring to other departments where they could do their jobs without worrying about being second-guessed by administrators more concerned with public relations than officer safety. Dad found the victim narrative particularly galling, given that Drummond's actual victim was me, someone who'd been walking to a car after work and ended up brutalized and arrested for no crime at all. Our federal lawsuit proceeded separately from the internal discipline, moving through discovery where both sides exchanged evidence and took depositions under oath. Drummond's deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Diane's office, and I attended to watch him answer questions about his actions and motivations. He appeared with 2 lawyers, one from his union, and one private attorney, both of whom objected frequently to Diane's questions and tried to limit what their client had to answer. Watching Drummond squirm under detailed questioning about his arrest patterns and his decision-making on the night of my arrest felt satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. He couldn't maintain his story under sustained examination, couldn't explain why he'd used force instead of asking questions, couldn't justify his assumptions without admitting to racial bias that would destroy his case. His lawyers called multiple breaks to consult privately with him, and by the afternoon session, he looked defeated and exhausted from defending the indefensible. The city's legal team approached Diane 3 weeks after Drummond's deposition with a settlement offer, proposing $600,000 in damages split between compensatory and punitive amounts, plus an agreement to implement specific reforms in training and accountability mechanisms. Diane presented the offer but recommended we reject it as inadequate, given the severity of the constitutional violations and the pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue for years. She believed we could get more if we went to trial, and more importantly, that a trial would create public record of the department's failures that a settlement would keep confidential. Dad agreed that public accountability mattered more than the settlement amount, and I trusted both their judgments about strategy. We sent back a counteroffer demanding $1.2 million plus the reforms and public admission of wrongdoing, betting that the city would rather pay more than face a jury trial that would generate weeks of negative publicity. Negotiations continued through summer with the settlement amount climbing as trial approached, and the city's lawyers recognized how strong our evidence was. They ultimately agreed to $1.1 million, implementation of comprehensive reforms including regular audits of arrest patterns to identify potential bias, mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off during police interactions, and a public statement from Chief Garrett acknowledging that my civil rights had been violated and committing to preventing similar incidents. The statement stopped short of admitting departmental liability but was strong enough that reporters and advocates recognized it as significant. We signed the settlement agreement in September, almost a year after the arrest, and Diane held another press conference announcing the outcome and emphasizing that the financial payment mattered less than the systemic changes that would hopefully protect future victims. I used part of the settlement money to fund a scholarship program for students of color pursuing legal careers, wanting something positive to emerge from the experience beyond just my personal compensation. The program would cover tuition and expenses for 2 students annually, selected based on demonstrated commitment to civil rights and social justice. The first recipients were announced at a ceremony where I spoke briefly about how my arrest had changed my understanding of policing and justice, and the gap between the rights we're promised on paper and the protection we actually receive in practice. Standing at that podium, talking about systemic racism and police violence felt surreal, given that a year earlier, I'd been face down on pavement getting brutalized by someone who was supposed to protect me, but the trauma had transformed into purpose that gave the whole experience meaning beyond just personal suffering. Drummond filed for bankruptcy 6 months after the settlement was announced, claiming the legal costs of defending himself and loss of his police career had destroyed him financially. His bankruptcy filing included claims that he'd been unfairly targeted and that his life had been ruined by a politically motivated prosecution, language that ignored his own actions and choices that had led to consequences. I felt no sympathy reading about his financial struggles, remembering how his knee had pressed into my spine and how his voice had threatened me while I'd tried to explain I wasn't the person he was looking for. Actions have consequences, and Drummond's consequences included losing his career and his reputation, and whatever financial security he'd built on years of policing that had apparently included systematically targeting people of color while hiding behind a badge. Dad got promoted to chief 2 years after my arrest, when Thomas Garrett retired, and his first major initiative was implementing the reforms our settlement had required, plus additional changes designed to root out officers whose behavior patterns resembled Drummond's. The police union fought him at every turn, but Dad had both public support from communities that wanted reform and political backing from a mayor who'd been elected on a platform of police accountability. 5 officers were fired in his first year as chief for excessive force or bias in their policing, and another dozen faced significant discipline that sent a message throughout the department about what would and wouldn't be tolerated. Some officers left voluntarily rather than work under what they called a hostile administration, and Dad considered their departures a positive development that made room for recruiting people who actually wanted to serve their communities rather than dominate them. I graduated from law school 3 years after the arrest and accepted a position at the public defender's office, representing people who couldn't afford attorneys and who often had experienced police misconduct similar to what I'd survived. My first client was a black teenager arrested for matching a description who'd been beaten by officers before being charged with resisting arrest, and working his case felt like directly confronting the system that had brutalized me. We won his case when body camera footage showed he'd never resisted and the injuries had been inflicted while he was restrained, and watching the prosecutor dismiss charges while the involved officers faced internal investigation felt like small but meaningful justice. Each case after that reinforced my understanding that my experience hadn't been unique or unusual, but representative of how policing functioned for too many people who looked like me, and that changing the system required sustained pressure from both inside and outside the institution. The bookstore parking lot where I'd been arrested got repaved 2 years after the incident, erasing the physical space where I'd lain face down tasting blood and oil while Drummond's knee compressed my spine. But the memory remained vivid, triggered occasionally by seeing police lights or hearing aggressive commands or experiencing any situation where I was vulnerable to authority figures who might abuse their power. The trauma didn't disappear just because time passed, or because I'd received a settlement, or because systemic changes were being implemented. It lived in my body and mind as a permanent reminder that safety wasn't guaranteed, and that the people sworn to protect could become threats faster than I could identify and avoid them. That knowledge changed how I moved through the world, made me more cautious and more aware, and while those weren't necessarily bad adaptations, they represented a loss of innocence that couldn't be recovered or compensated, regardless of how many policy reforms got implemented or how much money changed hands in settlement. 5 years after that night, I walked into a courtroom as lead counsel on a federal civil rights case against another police department in a neighboring jurisdiction, and across the room, I saw Drummond sitting in the gallery watching the proceedings. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something that might have been shame or might have been resentment before he looked away. He'd moved to another state and gotten work as a private security guard, rebuilding something resembling a career from the ruins of what he'd destroyed through his own choices. We didn't speak, and I didn't acknowledge his presence beyond that momentary eye contact, focused instead on representing my client, whose case mirrored my own experience in too many painful details. The trial lasted 3 days and resulted in a verdict against the department and the officers involved, and when I walked out of that courtroom with my client who'd survived police violence and fought for accountability, I felt the kind of peace that comes from transforming personal trauma into meaningful change that protects others from experiencing the same horrors. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.